Amen. Amen. So so welcome everybody. We're as I was just saying in the prayer, and Barbara was asking beforehand as well. It looks to me like we're 4 or 5 weeks away from completing Matthew's Gospel. Just at the current rate of verses we're going through. This is actually now, I think, I was just working out, Matthew's the Gospel I've taught through most regularly. So this will be the 3rd time I've finished Matthew. And it does feel every time you go through, you kind of think, oh, I see that a little bit better, a little bit deeper. But anyway, so thanks for sticking with me, those of you who've been right there from the beginning, right all those years ago. So we're into the trial now of Jesus, and there are 2 kind of sections. So I've called it trial and denial. We have the trial, and we have then Peter's denial connected. So we're running from Matthew 59 Matthew 26 verse 59 up to verse 75. And just to give it some context, if you remember, the last thing we'd read is how Peter had made his way into the courtyard of the high priest, the priestly mansion. It's a large building that's been identified. I was hoping to have been there this coming week, but obviously that, as most of you are aware, that trip has been postponed now. I was actually intending to get Jonathan, who I was travelling with, to stand in one place, and we were going to kind of do some of the scan throughs and so on. Not that we'd have done them on this particular teaching session, but it would have been good. So my prayer is that we get there eventually. So Peter has sat down in the courtyard, and we were told he sits down because his intention is to watch to the end. And I touched on this last week, because Matthew's Gospel never doesn't tell the truth to us. It always tells the truth, but it arranges material in a way that is misleading when we only have that Gospel. The most kind of natural, emotional way to read it then tells us that Peter actually does make it all the way through and witnesses the whole of the trial of Jesus. Whereas in actual fact, he only sees the kind of the early discovery phases. You can actually pick out, and I'll try and highlight that, and very often the English translators have made that assumption that that's what Matthew is saying, because that's the obvious sort of way. And the way they have translated in the English makes it almost impossible to read it any other way. So I will perhaps touch on a couple of points here where I've just given a slightly more vague translation to a word, which allows you to see how Matthew is still telling the truth, even though when we integrate it with Luke and with John's accounts, we discover that there's actually that Peter disappears halfway through. He doesn't see the end of the trial. But in terms of the way things are ordered today, we hear about the trial and then we hear about Peter's denial. So you put those together and it seems like the denial happens at the end of the trial. But actually the words Matthew uses are much more vague. They're kind of at the same sort of, they're describing something that's going on at the same time as the beginning and end of the trial. It will make sense when we get there. So we come in, Matthew's in the courtyard. Now it says, now the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were seeking false testimony against Jesus in order to put him to death. So when Peter has first arrived, Annas is there and is in this kind of pre-discovery phase. We're then told that after he's been with Annas, it's then when we go through the cockcrow and Peter denies Jesus in Luke's Gospel, and then Jesus is sent before Caiaphas, and both Annas and Caiaphas are chief priests. There's normally only one chief priest, but here we have it in the plural, and there was this strange period where Annas was, if you like, kind of chief priest emeritus, and the Romans had fired him, so he can't be high priest anymore. But to all intents and purposes, he still acted like high priest, but technically Caiaphas was the high priest and chaired the Sanhedrin. So as we put the Gospels together, we see that Jesus is with Annas first, he gets sent to Caiaphas, and then the Sanhedrin gather to him. So this little verse here that Matthew's saying, which it sounds as though Peter is the witness to the whole thing. He's not. He sees Jesus in front of Annas. He then denies him. goes off, but we'll get there eventually. So the whole Sanhedrin was seeking false testimony against Jesus in order to put him to death. And Matthew does, which is what he tends to do, is he packages together the whole story, which in actual fact takes place over a day and a bit. But it all kind of gets concertinaed into one. And he just kind of gives us the highlights, the things that are going on in the process. But they found nothing, even though many false witnesses came forward. So there is a semblance of order going on during this trial, in that witnesses are being brought in. And the initial accusation is that they are totally false witnesses. So they're bringing in people who are just saying things, but the entire Sanhedrin is not anti-Jesus. We know that Joseph is there, Joseph of Arimathea, and Nicodemus at the very least. And so they're a mixed bag. Not everybody is as anti-Jesus as Caiaphas and Annas, who are from the Sadducee sect. Those from the more Pharisaic sect are much more two-minded, and so they need to be convinced that Jesus has done something worthy of death. So when they bring in a false witness, although, as we're going to see, Jesus stays silent, in cross-interrogation and questions from people like Nicodemus or from Joseph, it's kind of clear, like, so when did you hear this? How did this get said? When was this? And those kind of details, that the accusations start to fall apart. And it turns out that they're not really credible. But finally, two came forward. And they said, this man has been saying, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, in Matthew's Gospel, we've never been told of somebody actually making that claim, I don't think. The claim itself, we are told about in John's Gospel. And in John's Gospel, we're told about it right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, before he's even started to move around in Galilee, before he's even called his disciples, who he's already met, but to come and follow him, to move with him, in other words, so that they go from town to town together. Before any of that has happened, Jesus has been in the temple. And you remember, and he turns over the money tables at the beginning of his ministry, very similar to the way he does at the end, but the actual consequences are very different, because at the beginning of his ministry, he's an unknown. He gets slapped around a little bit by the temple guard, who forcibly eject him, and he, at that point, while he's forcibly ejected, the statement is made that he would, if you destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Which is kind of interesting, because you know that physically present with him will be members of the temple guard who serve in shift rotations, so they're not all there all of the time. They're parts of the Levites. They're one of those services that services the temple that aren't priests. And so there's a kind of a collective of people who can serve in that role. And the temple guard has been involved in the arrest of Jesus the night before. So the fact it takes time kind of gives you the impression that the word about Jesus' arrest and his trial now before the Sanhedrin, which, as I'm going to say, make the statement here, is actually happening now in daylight, after sunrise, after Peter has denied Jesus. When the whole full Sanhedrin are gathered, Luke tells us it's after morning, after dawn. And this process is taking time. The word has kind of gone out, and someone has found members of the temple guard who are perhaps there physically at the beginning and remember Jesus making this outlandish statement, if you destroy this temple, I'll build it in 3 days. And they bring them in. And so they kind of stand in contrast as Matthew is telling the story. Although in Matthew, we don't understand all of the ins and outs as to where this phrase came from, who the people who are bringing it might be. But it is different, because it's not a false witness, it's a true witness. Jesus really has said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. So when we read this, we see this in contrast, as opposed to being the false stories that have been said. Here is now a real story. And it seems that as the questions are put to the witnesses who bring those words in, that the story stands up in front of the Sanhedrin. When did it happen? Well, it happened actually 3 years ago. You know, just last week he turned over the money tables and he caused that big riot. Oh yes, we all remember that. Well, actually, although it wasn't such a big public thing, he did the same thing some years back when he wasn't very well known. We pushed him out of the temple. Was there anybody that was verified? Yes, some people remember that. This is when he said it. There's no kind of contradictions. It's starting to kind of emerge as a true statement. In its own right, it's not that big a deal. Making a claim to be able to destroy the temple and rebuild it, you can get outraged, but it's not likely to kind of carry the sense of blasphemy. It's a kind of an outlandish claim by a Galilean carpenter, and nobody would kind of see it being particularly a heavy indictment. However, it does now have a ring of truth to it. There is something going on. That as people ask questions, that there's something of integrity coming back. Yes, there are people who could verify, I was there, he was there, so-and-so was there, we were all part of the temple guard on that time, we did that then, this is what happened. It resonates because Jesus has turned over the money tables again, but this time it's a big event because everybody knows who he is, and Jesus has been able to stay in the temple, unlike the first time where he gets kicked out. And so on. So standing up, the high priest said to him, and so there's obviously a frustration in Caiaphas at this stage, because Jesus has just kind of stayed very kind of quiet through the whole thing, and says, "Have you nothing to say? What do these men claim against you?" So he's taking the opportunity of having an accusation that is at least beginning to count for something, and looking now to get Jesus to start to say something, because Caiaphas has that sense, which you kind of get if you watch modern kind of police dramas, which is bringing him in for questioning and will make him confess. He kind of has that sense that if he can get Jesus to start saying something, Jesus will say something in front of folks that they'll be able to catch him on. So he kind of is he's leveraging a genuine accusation, something that there's genuinely something to answer to, even if it's not that serious. But Jesus was still silent. So the high priest now is getting really frustrated and says to him, "I demand under oath." And we often use the phrase adjure you, I adjure you, but it basically means it's a demand. It's a kind of command to speak from the position of oath. So it includes the word for an oath, and it's a command to speak. So I demand under oath by the living God that you tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of the Son of God. So something has now shifted in the way that the trial is progressing. So it's gone ahead with people coming in, making false accusations that are falling apart, don't really stand up. It's moved to a phase where some people have come in with a genuine accusation, but it's kind of a bit outlandish, but it's not really serious enough. But the high priests know that they're betting on everything that they can get Jesus to claim one of those things in front of the Sanhedrin that they can condemn him to death. And in that place, he's made that demand to adjure you, are you the Christ, the Son of God? Which would have been an outlandish thing for Jesus to claim, although we'd think not, because he is the Christ. but when it's kind of like somebody has to be the famous person. But there are lots of people who might say, have you seen so-and-so? Does that look like so-and-so? And there are more people who are wrong than aren't. But in this case, Jesus is the Christ. But in Jesus' answer, who's now been adjured, it's quite clearly, if you like, within Jesus' control. He could kind of continue to, in American terms, plead the fifth, just stay silent. But in this kind of context, he knows in many ways he has to give them something, because he's approached this in prayer through Gethsemane, when he was on the Mount of Transfiguration, where they were talking about his death. He knows that he has to die, and he has to die in Jerusalem. He's prophesied that in the past. He knows what's coming. He's not participated, but now he's asked to say something that will definitely stir the crowd up, definitely stir the council up. Are you the Christ, the Son of God? But somebody's at least got to be that. But Jesus actually then gives them a response that takes it even further. which must have delighted Caiaphas and why he get the kind of big reaction from him. So Jesus said to him, "You've said it." Yeah, that's the easy part. You've claimed the easy part. Yes, I'm the Christ, the Son of God. But I tell you, after this, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And this is the shock of what Jesus says in front of the Sanhedrin, even with people there who are sympathetic towards him. Those who are secret followers like Joseph and Nicodemus, and others who at least have some sympathy, are interested in the kinds of things he's been saying. What Jesus says is so outrageous, because he's making a reference to those passages in Daniel that refer to the Son of Man. Not, if you like, in human terms, because the Son of Man, Jesus has been calling himself that as he goes around, but in a literal phrase, Son of Man, Son of Adam, it just means Joe human. It's kind of a very... But in the book of Daniel, the Son of Man is seen there in the clouds with God, and the Son of Man acts like God and is kind of understood as a theophany, a physical manifestation of the power and the glory of God. And in that context, he then says, you'll see the Son of Man sitting. So sitting, well, where do you sit in the presence of God? Well, in the presence of God, the ark was there, shepherding the presence of God, and it has a mercy seat in it. And God sits in the mercy seat. But here is the Son of Man sitting in the mercy seat, and coming on the clouds of heaven. And this scene, which is a cosmic scene, is acted out year by year in the Holy of Holies, when the priest enters, not surrounded by the clouds of heaven, but surrounded by clouds of incense, and comes and stays standing in the presence of God. Back in the day, it would have been the mercy seat, but of course the ark has been lost so far. And coming before the presence of God. And here Jesus is saying that one that looks like they're human in Daniel, that's me. I'm not just the Messiah, but there's a dimension to the Messiah you've never fully understood. He is actually divine. He is part of the Godhead. He's sitting there at the right hand of power, because there's still the Father, coming in the clouds, not of incense, but in the clouds of heaven. Whether we understand that as kind of sky clouds or kind of spiritual sense, it doesn't really matter. Theologically, they understood what he's getting at. And so the claim is not just to be someone that you might think I'm big-headed for claiming to be, but actually being someone like that, but also more than that, to actually have been the foundation, the Word of God, the eternal God, all of this time, but in human form. So not surprisingly, often kind of, you try and wonder how it happened. You wonder if there's a moment of shocked silence as Jesus said that. You remember in the Garden of Gethsemane when they come to arrest him, and they say, "Are you Jesus?" and he says, "I am," and they fall back. Which is almost like that sense of there's a revelation that causes shock in the garden when the arrest comes. You almost imagine here whether there's a moment of silence around the Sanhedrin as this statement is made, this shocking kind of revelation. And after a second or two, the high priest kind of gets his head together. So at this, the high priest tore his clothes. Suddenly realised, I've got to make sure everybody remembers this. I'll do something to mark it. So rip my clothes to make it really memorable. And says, he's blasphemed. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now, you've all heard the blasphemy. And suddenly, in one sense, if you like, the manipulative power is now in the hand of Caiaphas. What do you think? In response, they said, he is worthy of death. And even for those who would be supportive of Jesus, and who may have even been playing with the thing of, is he the Messiah, or is he the prophet, or is he one of those figures that has prophesied throughout history, they may have even toyed with those ideas, and they might have said, well, I don't think so because they don't do this, but he could be because of that. The statement he's made is so revelatory, shocking, because the whole book of Hebrews, in one sense, is an exposition of the truth of this, about coming now before the presence of God with a high priest who's coming in the clouds but gets to sit down, all of those things that are there in the whole book of Hebrews for us now, but is being revealed in a moment. So in response, they said he's worthy of death. What he is claiming is outrageous. He is worthy of death. And at the same time, they spat in his face and punched while others slapped him. Gives a little verse 67 there, gives me an opportunity just to flag something, which is at the same time, you often it's the Greek words tote. It just means then, but in our I've gone with at the same time it's kind of all part of the mix. So the reason I've done it there is 66. They're responding, he's worthy of death, and while they're saying he's worthy of death, so it's at the same time. Because in English, when we say then, we often see it. Our instinct, it doesn't have to mean, but our instinct is to hear this happened. Next thing to happen is this. So A happens, B happens. If you look at the use of the word in Greek, and you find it's often used as a translation for a similar word, which I just can't remember off the top of my head now, in Hebrew. It means it more literally means this kind of process within this season, and exactly how close that it could be before or it could be after. So it could be before now, or it could be, or it could be at the same time. It could be all of those. It just means within the same kind of time frame, and the time frame is defined by the wider context. So, for instance, if you were to use the word tote when at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, Matthew gives a summary of Jesus' first kind of Galilean tour, going up to Syria, and then when he's using the word then, your first context is the then is kind of that entire year and a half that is covered by this during that period. But it gets narrowed down a little bit because he might be in Capernaum, in which case then could just mean when he's in Capernaum. But if you've narrowed it down a bit more, the context is kind of he's in so-and-so's house, then probably means while he's in the house. So it doesn't always have to mean this happened and then this followed. Now, the reason I say it here is because it's often the use of the word then that makes people think this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And we don't see that very often there's an overlap, and that comes out in a little bit. So I just thought I'd mention it here, even though it's not really controversial here. It's just at the same time as they're saying he's worthy of death, people are spitting in his face. It's not kind of like they all kind of stand up and say he's worthy of death, worthy of death. Now we finish that, then we go and punch him, if you see what I mean. So they spat in his face, punched while others slapped him. And they were saying, it's all kind of going on, prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you? Peter has actually seen a bit of this, although Peter by now is no longer witness to these events because the Sanhedrin has gathered. He's there in that quiet space in the courtyard before dawn. But he has already witnessed Jesus being struck because when he spoke back to Annas, the high priest, and he didn't say that Jesus makes the statement, "I didn't realize you were the high priest," which Jesus probably did know. But the point he was making is there only should be one high priest. There's two at the moment, and he's been slapped. So that's in there. Prophesied who hit you. Peter has seen that. And then we get to the meanwhile, and that meanwhile here, you see. It's a different word. It's a consequential word, but you could have put it as kind of an also, or you could have used then. It's a slightly different word, but gets the same thing as meanwhile, while all of this has been going on, not just the final moments, the whole trial process. Meanwhile, while the whole trial has been going on, Peter was sitting outside in the court, but a servant girl came up to him saying, "You also with Jesus the Galilean." So now we're kind of taking a step backwards in time to the night time. But he denied it in front of everyone, saying, "I didn't know what you were talking about." I don't know what you're talking about, sorry. And he had also, he had also gone out to the gateway, you see. So Matthew doesn't actually tell us whether it was in the gateway first or the courtyard first. It's just that while all of this was going on, this had happened in the courtyard. He'd also been out by the gateway, and someone else saw him and said, "This is the man who was with Jesus of Nazareth." But again, he denied it. So it probably does imply this is later. Again, he denied it, swearing, "I don't know the man." But after a short while, those standing around came up to Peter, and they said, "Surely you are one of them as well. Even your speech gives you away." And at that he began to curse and swear, and says, I don't know the man. And straightway a cock crowed. And Peter remembered the words of Jesus when he said, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. So he went out and wept bitterly. Now, as I say, you put the story together with the other Gospels outside of Matthew, we see there's also the moment where there's eye contact made between Jesus and Peter at that moment as he goes out and then he weeps. And this is now beginning of dawn. If we were going to go on to chapter 27 right now, I think the first verse, which I haven't put in here, so I can't claim it, is it actually says in the morning they took him to Pilate. So no, it says it's not the first verse. I think it says they rough him up and kind of arrest him. And then it says in the morning they took him to Pilate, which makes us all think that this has all happened at night. But actually, dawn has already come. The point we know when Peter denies Jesus, and according to Luke, he looks up and makes eye contact with Jesus, and that's before the end of the trial there. But the point I've made before, if you've done the kind of the resurrection walkthroughs, is that actually there is a lost day because there are no witnesses to it. Part of the reason that Matthew has included Peter at the beginning, and he's included the story of how much of the trial, he's seen a bit of the trial, is because he's doing what is what's important in the genre of ancient biography, which is to kind of flag who your witnesses are. But Peter has avoided telling us about Joseph or Nicodemus, because Joseph and Nicodemus are still members of the Sanhedrin at the time Matthew's Gospel is being written. And it's a bit awkward for them to be so intimately involved with the Gospel story. John is able, writing later and from a further distance away than Jerusalem, to name them. And actually maybe they've even... who knows if they're still alive at this point. Actually, no, they would be. They would be when John is written, because he uses them as his eyewitnesses. But the point of understanding the structure of ancient biography is that your people who are standing there watching in are the people who have recounted the story to you. And so Peter is key to knowing that somebody sees part of the trial. Peter kind of fuzzes the fact up, but he also reduces the fullness of the trial just down to a few verses. And he finishes, the last thing that happens in the trial is reference to something that actually Peter had seen earlier. So it's still true, because he's kind of saying, look, my key source is Peter. Peter, along with the 12, again, I'm assuming if you've gone through some of the things we've done when we look at the book of Acts, and this is part of what the teaching of the apostles is all about. It's actually consolidating the stories of Jesus, you see. So Peter chairs that for the first 10 years of the church before handing on to James. So Peter is a key person that people would know. He's still alive as a witness, as an eyewitness. He is there through the early parts of the trial. He sees the basics of what's being accused and how it's working. He doesn't see the whole story. We know from John's Gospel, and we've got the markers from John as to who the witnesses are. They're Nicodemus and Joseph. During that process, we've returned and we've heard now about the denial, which reminds us again that the process that we've seen over the last few chapters, where Jesus has predicted the difficulty that the disciples are going to go through. And so Peter goes out and, as I say, and weeps. And so next week what we'll be looking at obviously is Jesus now being sent and tried before Pilate. Again, as we put the Gospels together, we discover that the witnesses of the trial in front of Pilate are Jesus' family and Mary. I think, and Anne will know that I've changed my mind on this. I normally say we don't know where Peter is, but I noticed the other day, sorry, I'll have to look this one up. I noticed the other day that in one of Peter's letters, he makes a reference to being a witness. So let me just see if I can throw this one in. it's useful for me to throw this in because it helps me to remember something that I spotted. Otherwise, I forget it again after a while. So where's Peter? It's right near the end. Yeah, so therefore I exhort you, 1 Peter chapter 5. So I exhort the elders among you as fellow elders and witnesses of the sufferings of Christ. This was, we were looking at this last week, weren't we? That was it. That's why I'm thinking about it. That's when I noticed it, I think. As fellow elders, and so I'm an elder like you are, and a witness of the sufferings. So the witness of the sufferings could just refer to Gethsemane, but it's quite a broad statement. I was a witness to the sufferings of Christ, and also in a partaker in the glory that's to be revealed. And the glory that to be revealed that Peter was a witness to and partook in was, of course, the resurrection. So he's kind of got these three statements. I'm exhorting you. I'm an elder like you are in the church. I was a witness to his suffering and his glory, and so there I wonder now, although he's never recounted in the story as being around the cross, whether in his shame there is a bit of distance and Peter is aware of the events, but it's just not in the action with the others because of this betrayal. Because of the betrayal, even though there are others that he would know there, family of Jesus, John, the disciple, Mary, etc., who are witnesses of the suffering on the cross, he doesn't so much interact with them because of the shame of his denial and the shock of what's going on. So we'll finish there, which I'm quite pleased that we've done speedy, which is what we've done about the time that I always intended these to be, instead of the usual 45 minutes plus. But does anyone want to ask any questions or make any observations at this stage?